Millionaire Heiress pretends to be paralyzed to test her husband, but the black janitor proves his true love. "Honey, are you sure you can't feel anything in your legs?" Richard asked for the third time that morning, but his eyes showed no genuine concern, just poorly concealed impatience as he constantly checked his cell phone. Victoria Hamilton lay motionless in the hospital bed of her Beverly Hills mansion, observing every micro-expression of the man she had married just 6 months earlier. At 28, heiress to a pharmaceutical empire valued at $200 million, she never imagined she would have to pretend to be paralyzed to find out if his own husband truly loved her. The accident had happened 3 days ago, at least that's what everyone believed. A seemingly serious fall down the mansion stairs, followed by hours in surgery and the devastating medical diagnosis: complete paralysis of the legs, possibly permanent. "The doctor said it could take months to know if I'll walk again," Victoria murmured, carefully studying Richard's reaction. You'll stay with me, won't you?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to confirm the suspicions Victoria had been harboring for weeks. Over the past few months, she had noticed whispered phone conversations, quickly deleted messages, and his sudden interest in the details of his will. "Of course I will, dear," Richard finally replied, but he was already getting up from his chair. "I just need to take care of a few things at the office. Important business that can't wait." That was when Jerome Washington entered the room, discreetly pushing the cleaning cart. At 45, the man had been working as a caretaker at the mansion for over 15 years, long before Richard appeared in Victoria's life. Jerome had known the family since Victoria was a teenager, and his kind eyes always showed more genuine affection for her than many people who called themselves her friends. "Good morning, Miss Victoria," Jerome greeted her respectfully, as he always did, even after he got married. "How are you feeling today?" The difference was striking. While Richard could barely hide his discomfort with the situation, Jerome approached the bed with genuine concern, gently adjusting the pillows and checking to see if she was comfortable. "Jerome, you don't need to worry about me," Victoria whispered, but internally her determination grew stronger. That cruel test, suggested by his personal lawyer after they discovered some suspicious financial transactions in Richard's name, was revealing truths that she would rather not have known. Richard left the room without even saying goodbye properly, claiming he had an urgent meeting that would last all day. Jerome remained, quietly tidying up the room, but Victoria noticed how he occasionally glanced at her with concern. "Mr. Jerome," she called softly, "could you do me a favor? If I need anything today, could you stay around?" Jerome's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and determination. "Of course, Miss Victoria. I'll cancel my other appointments. You shouldn't be alone at this time." There was the first clear clue of what was to come. While his husband shirked his responsibility to care for her at her most vulnerable moment, a man, demonstrated the loyalty and love she so desperately sought. What Richard didn't know was that every absence, every lame excuse, and every display of disinterest was being carefully documented. Victoria wasn't just a spoiled heiress. She was an intelligent woman who had learned to read people long before she inherited her fortune. At that moment, as Jerome delicately adjusted the air conditioning temperature for her comfort, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. His test had only just begun, but she already knew who had passed and who had failed miserably. If he's enjoying this story about true love and false appearances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens when a powerful woman decides to teach a lesson about character will surprise him in ways he never imagined. The next morning, Victoria woke up to the sound of whispered voices coming from the hallway. Through the half-open door, she could make out Richard talking to someone on the phone, her voice laden with an irritation he had never shown when he thought she could hear him. "No, it can't be permanent. You need to get a second medical opinion," Richard muttered, pacing nervously through the mansion's hall. "What do you mean, only time will tell? That's not enough of an answer for me." Victoria quickly closed her eyes when she heard footsteps approaching. Richard entered the room with a forced smile, carrying a tray with breakfast that Jerome had clearly prepared. "Good morning, love. How was your night?" Her voice sounded studiously concerned, but Victoria picked up on the tension behind the kind words. "I didn't get much sleep," she replied truthfully. "My legs. Sometimes it feels like I can feel something, but then I can't move anything." Richard's face twitched briefly, a micro-expression of frustration that confirmed all of Victoria's suspicions. He wasn't waiting for her recovery. He was clearly waiting for definitive answers that would allow him to make some kind of decision. "I brought his favorite coffee," he said, placing the tray on the bedside table with mechanical movements. I have to leave early today. Meeting with investors about that new project I mentioned. Victoria knew exactly which project he was referring to. 3 weeks before the accident, Richard had proposed a series of aggressive investments that would require complete access to the pharmaceutical company's accounts. At the time, she had hesitated, claiming she needed to consult with the board of directors. Now, her medical condition created a situation where Richard, as his spouse, could potentially make certain decisions on his behalf. "Richard," she said softly, watching every nuance of his reaction, "do you think I'll be okay? I mean, really okay?" He hesitated for just a second, but it was long enough. "Of course you will, honey. Doctors these days perform miracles." Miracles. No certainty, no confidence, just a vague hope that sounded more like wishful thinking than genuine conviction. After Richard left, Jerome quietly entered to collect the tray. Victoria had eaten only a few bites, but he made no comment. Instead, he noted that she seemed tense. "Miss Victoria, may I ask if everything is all right? Beyond the medical situation, I mean." The question took Victoria by surprise. In 15 years of working for the family, Jerome had always kept a respectful distance, never prying into personal matters. But something in her voice suggested that he had noticed things he would rather not have noticed. "Jerome," she began carefully, have you noticed anything different lately? Before the accident, I mean." Jerome paused, clearly weighing his words. As a middle-aged black man working for an extremely wealthy family, he had learned to navigate delicate conversations with diplomacy. "Well, miss, it's not my place to judge, but," he hesitated, then continued with measured caution, "Mr. Richard has been getting a lot of phone calls. And he has visitors who come when you're not home." Visitors. Victoria felt her stomach clench. What kind of visitors? Lawyers. Brokers. And a young woman who came 3 times last week while you were visiting her sister in San Francisco. Victoria's blood seemed to run cold. Richard had insisted that she take that trip, claiming it would be good for her to have some time with her family before the marriage settled in completely. At the time, she had found his insistence odd, but now she was beginning to understand. "Jerome, can I trust he?" she asked directly. His eyes locked with her eyes with an intensity that revealed decades of genuine loyalty. "Miss Victoria, I have worked for this family since you were a teenager. I watched you grow up, study, fight to prove that you deserve to run the family business even though you were a woman. If you need anything at all, you can count on me." At that moment, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. Looking at Jerome, she whispered, "I think my husband is trying to rob me. And I need proof before it's too late." Jerome nodded slowly, as if he already suspected this possibility. "What do you need him to do?" "First, I need you to install some discreet cameras around the house. Second, I need you to monitor all visitors when Richard thinks I'm asleep or resting. And third," she paused, knowing she was about to cross an irreversible line, "I need you to help me find out exactly what's going on with my bank accounts." Jerome remained silent for a moment, processing the gravity of the situation. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders straightened with determination. "Miss Victoria, throughout all these years, her family has treated him with dignity when others wouldn't even acknowledge him. If someone is trying to harm her, especially by taking advantage of her current medical condition, I won't hesitate for a second to help her find out the truth." That afternoon, while Richard was at yet another of his important meetings, Jerome discreetly installed micro-cameras at strategic points in the mansion: Richard's office, the main living room, and the entrance hall. Victoria, in her wheelchair, oversaw everything, feeling for the first time in days that she was regaining some control over her own life. What Richard didn't know was that Victoria Hamilton wasn't just a wealthy heiress accustomed to comfort. She had built and expanded the family's pharmaceutical empire precisely because she knew how to spot people who tried to manipulate her. And now, from what he considered her most vulnerable position, she was about to demonstrate that underestimating a smart woman, especially one with resources and a loyal ally, would be the biggest mistake he could make. As Jerome finished camouflaging the last camera, Victoria received a message on her cell phone. It was from Richard. "Meeting will run late. Don't wait up for me." For the first time since the beginning of this cruel test, Victoria smiled. Richard was offering exactly what she needed: time, privacy, and enough rope for he himself to hang. Every lie he told, every absence he justified, and every display of impatience with her condition was being carefully documented. What he interpreted as an easy victory over an incapacitated wife was, in fact, evidence being built against him by a woman who had decided that the only thing worse than discovering her husband's betrayal would be to allow him to get away with it. Over the next 2 weeks, the Hamilton mansion was transformed into a secret operations center. While Richard believed he was dealing with a helpless and dependent wife, Victoria and Jerome methodically built a dossier that would destroy any credibility he might have. The cameras installed by Jerome captured much more than she had expected. In the first week, they recorded Richard on the phone with someone named Isabella, discussing intimate details that clearly did not involve business. "Yes, love, we'll soon be free of this circus. The doctor said it could be permanent, so maybe it's time to speed up our plans," he whispered, pacing the office that had once belonged to Victoria's father. But it was in the second week that the recordings revealed the true extent of the betrayal. Richard had arranged a meeting at home with Marcus Williams, a lawyer specializing in complex matrimonial matters, a euphemism for divorces of very wealthy people. Considering her current medical condition, Williams explained as Jerome, ostensibly organizing the nearby bookshelf, listened intently, there is a legal window where you could argue temporary mental incapacity due to trauma. That would significantly facilitate the transfer of certain financial responsibilities. Victoria, watching the recordings later on her laptop, felt a mixture of nausea and determination. Richard wasn't just planning to abandon her, he was planning to steal her company, using his fabricated medical condition as legal justification. "Miss Victoria," Jerome said softly, entering the room with a tray of tea, "I've gotten more information about the woman from the phone calls." He handed Victoria a folder containing social media printouts, bank statements he had discreetly photographed from Richard's office, and even photos that caught Richard entering a luxurious apartment in the city center. Isabella Martinez, 24 years old, model and aspiring actress, Jerome reported with the efficiency of a private investigator. Richard has been paying her apartment rent for 6 months. The payments began exactly 3 weeks before his wedding. Victoria studied the evidence with the same meticulous attention he used to analyze the company's financial reports. Richard hadn't just started an extramarital affair, he had planned it before the wedding, probably calculating that it would be easier to access the family's money as a husband than as a boyfriend. "Jerome, I need you to help me with something more delicate," her said, closing the folder. "I need access to the company's bank accounts. If Richard is trying to move money, I need to see exactly what he's doing." That night, Jerome helped Victoria quietly transfer to the office in her wheelchair. With decades of experience keeping the mansion running, he knew every floorboard that creaked, every door that squeaked. They moved through the house like ghosts. On the office computer, Victoria discovered a series of transfers that left her breathless. Richard had moved nearly $2 million to accounts she didn't recognize, using a temporary medical power of attorney he had obtained based on her unstable mental condition after the accident. "Son of a bitch," she muttered, something Jerome had never heard from the always polite heiress. "He's literally stealing her company while she pretends to be incapacitated." But then Victoria had an idea that would change everything. If Richard was using her medical condition to justify his actions, she would use that same condition to teach him exactly the lesson he deserved. "Jerome, I need you to contact Thomas Bailey," she said, referring to the best corporate fraud lawyer in the state. "And I need you to be very specific about what you tell him." Over the next few days, Victoria carefully orchestrated the next steps of his plan. Thomas Bailey, disguised as a medical rehabilitation specialist, made several home visits to assess Victoria's progress. In reality, he was legally documenting all the evidence of financial fraud that Jerome had collected. Richard, completely oblivious to what was happening, became even more careless. One afternoon, Victoria pretended to be asleep when Isabella showed up at the mansion, the first time the mistress had dared to set foot in his wife's house. Through the half-open door, Victoria watched Richard show the young woman the family's valuable art collection, promising that soon all of this will be ours. "Honey, are you sure it's not her who won't find out?" Isabella asked, caressing a Ming vase that had been in the Hamilton family for 3 generations. "Isabella, love, she can barely get out of bed. And even if she could, the transfers have already been processed." The lawyer said that, considering her mental state, it would be almost impossible to reverse anything, Richard replied with an arrogance that made Victoria clench her fists. But the last straw came 3 days later, when Victoria pretended to have a severe medical relapse. Jerome called Richard, who was working late. In fact, he was having dinner with Isabella at an expensive restaurant, paying with Victoria's company credit card. "Mr. Richard, Miss Victoria has taken ill. The doctor said it's important for you to be here," Jerome said on the phone, while Victoria listened on the extension. "Jerome, I can't leave right now. It's a very important meeting. Give her medicine and call me if it's really urgent," Richard replied, clearly annoyed at the interruption of his romantic date. At that moment, Victoria made her final decision. Richard had failed the most basic test of humanity, choosing her sick wife over his mistress. Now it was time for he to learn that underestimating Victoria Hamilton had been the biggest mistake of his life. "Jerome," she said, her voice laden with cold determination, "tomorrow we're going to make a very special phone call. It's time for his dear Richard to find out that not all people in wheelchairs are as helpless as they seem." What Richard didn't know was that Victoria had documented every lie, every fraudulent transfer, and every moment of neglect. More importantly, she had discovered something about his past that would not only justify her revenge, but make it legally irrefutable. While Richard celebrated what he believed to be his easy victory over an incapacitated wife, Victoria Hamilton was about to demonstrate that his true incapacity was to have underestimated a woman who had built an empire precisely because she knew how to identify and destroy people like he. The trap was sprung on a Thursday afternoon when Richard arrived home expecting to find his incapacitated wife resting as usual. Instead, he found Victoria sitting elegantly in the main living room, not in her wheelchair, but in her favorite armchair, her legs crossed and a smile that would make any intelligent person run far away. "Hi, honey," she said softly, holding a glass of wine. "How was his day stealing my company?" Richard froze in the doorway. Her keys fell to the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the deadly silence of the mansion. "Victoria, how? How am I walking?" "Funny you should ask that, considering I've never actually been paralyzed," she replied, rising gracefully. "But I'm sure you'd like to know how I found out about Isabella, the fraudulent bank transfers, and his plans to have me committed to a psychiatric clinic so he could have full access to my money." Richard's face drained of color. Her hands began to shake visibly. "Richard, he can explain." "Oh, but there's no need to explain anything," she interrupted, picking up a tablet from the table. "I have everything here. Recordings, bank statements, photos of her entering her mistress's apartment, phone conversations where you two plan how to commit me. It was very educational." Richard tried to take a step toward her, but Jerome appeared silently beside Victoria, no longer the humble caretaker, but clearly positioned as an ally and protector. "Mr. Richard," Jerome said calmly, "I believe it would be best if it were his pleasure to sit down." "You don't understand," Richard stammered, ignoring Jerome completely. "Isabella means nothing. The investments. I was trying to multiply our money." Victoria laughed, a cold sound that made Richard instinctively recoil. "His money?" Interesting choice of words for someone who transferred $2.4 million to personal accounts using a fraudulent medical power of attorney. It was then that Richard noticed the methodically organized papers on the coffee table. Legal documents, photographs, bank statements, all meticulously catalogued as evidence. "Attorney Thomas Bailey has been in the office for an hour preparing the documents for his divorce and criminal proceedings," Victoria continued conversationally. "Isabella is also going to get a little surprise. We discovered that her has 3 other married boyfriends, financing her luxurious lifestyle. I imagine you two will have a lot to talk about in prison." Richard slumped heavily onto the sofa, the reality of the situation finally sinking into his brain. You planned all this." "Planned it?" Victoria approached, her footsteps echoing with authority. "Richard, dear, I merely created a situation where you could show who he really is. And you did not disappoint in the slightest." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Jerome opened the door to reveal 2 detectives from the Financial Fraud Department, followed by Attorney Thomas Bailey carrying a bulky briefcase. "Mrs. Hamilton," Detective Martinez greeted her, "we brought the warrants you requested." Richard looked desperately from Victoria to the police officers. "Wait, this can't be happening. Victoria, you're overreacting. We can work this out between us." "Work it out between us?" Victoria laughed again. "Like when he abandoned me in the hospital because he thought I'd never walk again. Or when he told Isabella the first was mentally unstable and it would be easy to take my inheritance." The detectives approached Richard, who was visibly panicking. "Mr. Richard Thompson, you are under arrest for financial fraud, falsification of medical documents, and embezzlement. No, this is a misunderstanding. Richard shouted, standing up abruptly. Victoria, please. I love him. Victoria stopped right in front of him, looking him straight in the eye. Love? Richard, you showed love when you abandoned me the moment you thought I was broken and useless. Jerome, a man you didn't even greet properly, showed more genuine care for me in a week than you did in 6 months of marriage. As Richard was being handcuffed, he made one last desperate attempt. The money. I can pay it all back. You will pay it back, Victoria replied coldly. Through the courts. Every penny, plus interest, plus damages for emotional distress. And Richard? Isabella's apartment? I discovered that the lease is in his corporate name. Consider the eviction a belated wedding gift. As Richard was led away by the detectives, still babbling empty apologies and promises, Victoria turned to Jerome, who had watched everything with quiet dignity. Jerome, she said softly, thank you for showing me how true character reveals itself in the most difficult moments. Jerome smiled respectfully. Miss Victoria, you have always had enough strength. You just needed someone to recognize it when everyone else failed. Outside, the sirens receded, carrying Richard away to a reality very different from the one he had planned. Her attempt to steal from a woman who pretended to be vulnerable had become the perfect trap. He had handed over all the evidence necessary for his own destruction, believing he was dealing with a helpless victim. As Victoria watched the police cars disappear into the distance from her window, a sense of peace washed over her. Richard had revealed his true nature when he thought she was at her weakest, but he discovered too late that underestimating Victoria Hamilton had been the most costly mistake of her life. A man who had tried to steal not only his money but her dignity would now face the consequences of mistaking feigned compassion for real vulnerability. 6 months later, the Hamilton mansion exuded a completely different energy. The same walls that had witnessed betrayal were now the scene of a transformation that no one could have predicted. Victoria sat in his office, no longer as a woman feigning vulnerability, but as the CEO she had always been, reviewing contracts for the pharmaceutical company's expansion into 3 new countries. The empire Richard had tried to steal had not only remained intact, but had grown 40% since his arrest. Miss Victoria, Jerome entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, but now wore a smart suit instead of his janitor's uniform. The lawyers have confirmed that Richard's final appeal has been denied. He will serve the full 7 years. Victoria smiled, accepting the coffee. Jerome was no longer her employee. He was his chief operating officer, a position she had created specifically to recognize not only his loyalty but his natural intelligence for solving problems and his ability to see into people's characters. And Isabella? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. Arrested for fraud in 3 different states. They found out that she'd been running the same scam for years, Jerome replied, sitting down in the chair across the table. The apartment that Richard was paying for was just one of 5 that she maintained with money from married men. Jerome's transformation had been as dramatic as Richard's downfall. A man who had spent 15 years being treated as invisible by high society now attended board meetings, charity dinners, and had become a respected voice in Beverly Hills business circles. Victoria had discovered that he had an MBA he had never mentioned, obtained through night classes while working as a janitor during the day. There's one more thing, Jerome said, handing Victoria an elegant envelope. It arrived today. Victoria opened the envelope and laughed as she read the contents. It was an invitation to the wedding of Thomas Bailey, the lawyer who had helped expose Richard, to a prosecutor he had met during the case. On the back was a handwritten note. Thank you for reminding me that not every divorce case has to end in bitterness. Sometimes it ends with the right person finding his true place in the world. Meanwhile, in a state penitentiary 200 miles away, Richard was learning that the reality of prison was very different from the movies. His shared cell, miserable meals, and mandatory cleaning jobs were a cruel contrast to the luxurious life he had tried to maintain by stealing from Victoria. Her desperate letters to Victoria, asking for forgiveness, promising change, begging for a second chance, always came back stamped recipient refused delivery. Isabella hadn't answered his calls since she found out he no longer had access to his ex-wife's money. What tortured Richard most was not the loss of his freedom, but knowing that Jerome, the man he had never properly greeted, whom he considered merely the help, now lived the life he had dreamed of having with Victoria. The news came through magazines that other inmates left scattered around the prison library, photos of Victoria and Jerome at social events, articles about the exponential growth of the pharmaceutical company, mentions of Jerome as the brilliant right-hand man of the Hamilton heiress. Back at the mansion, Victoria stood at the same window where months earlier she had planned her revenge. But now, instead of bitterness, she felt deep gratitude. "Jerome," she said softly, "may I ask him a personal question?" "Of course, Miss Victoria." "Why did you never tell me about his MBA? Why did you agree to work as a janitor all these years?" Jerome smiled, an expression that combined dignity with genuine humility. "Because honest work has never been a source of shame for me. And because sometimes we need to be in the right places for the right reasons to recognize when we meet people who deserve our loyalty." Victoria nodded, understanding. Richard had seen wealth where he could find something to steal. Jerome had seen a person who deserved respect and protection. "There's something I never properly thanked you for," Victoria continued. "You saved me from a lifetime married to a man who saw me only as a walking bank account. Miss Victoria, you saved yourself. I was just there when you needed someone to see you as a human being instead of an object." At that moment, Victoria realized that the real lesson of the whole experience was not about revenge or justice. It was about recognizing people's true value. Richard had failed the most basic test of humanity because he saw vulnerability to exploit. Jerome had passed life's test because he saw dignity to protect. 3 years later, the story gained an epilogue that even Victoria could not have imagined. Jerome and Victoria were married in a simple ceremony at the same mansion where it all began. It was not a marriage of convenience or gratitude, but the natural result of 2 years of discovering that real compatibility is built through mutual respect, shared values, and the ability to see beauty in each other's character. Richard, serving the 6th year of his sentence, learned of the wedding through a letter her sent him. For the first time, he fully understood that he had lost not only money or status, he had lost the chance to be with an extraordinary woman because he was unable to love her when she needed it most. Victoria Hamilton learned that the best revenge is not to destroy those who betrayed you, but to build a life so full and authentic that betrayal becomes irrelevant. She discovered that true love is not revealed in moments of abundance, but in moments when all seems lost, and that sometimes the most valuable people in our lives are right beside us, waiting patiently to be truly seen. Richard tried to steal his money by pretending to love him, but he lost everything because he failed to recognize when true love was offered freely. Jerome won Victoria's heart not through manipulation or self-interest, but by demonstrating that authentic character always trumps superficial charm. If this story of overcoming adversity, justice, and true love touched his heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that sometimes the right people are closer than we think, and that true wealth lies in recognizing the value of those who love him not for what he has, but for who he is.